But thank you everyone for joining us. You are all finalists in the 2023 Fiscal Challenge, and we're excited to see you in less than a month. Professor Bryce Gartner of Duke's Fuqua School of Business is going to be walking you through data visualization, storytelling, and all the ways that you can improve your final presentation for the judges. This will be important for two reasons. First is the task at hand, having your best presentation possible at the finals. And the second is just the power of data and storytelling in the rest of your life. No matter grad school interview you go into after your undergrad program, people are going to be interested in your ability to take a complex problem, present the data, and tell a convincing story to make a difference. So I hope you all enjoy. Thank you for being here.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Erica. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. I am going to kind of give you the crash course in data visualization and storytelling. To give you a little bit of background on me, I got into teaching this class because about 14 years ago, I got introduced to some of the technologies that were up and coming that enabled data visualization, and started a company focused 100% on helping people do data analysis, working with big data, and helping them tell data stories to people inside their organizations so they could be more efficient and effective. It was the typical entrepreneurial story. Started in the home office, built a company, and became one of the largest consulting and resellers of analytics and visualization software in North and South America, won several awards for that. And then ultimately, we got to work with some of the biggest companies in the world, Amazon, Apple, a whole bunch of other companies, helping them really understand how they could tell better stories with really large sets of data, and understanding the principles of visualization, but more importantly, understanding how to turn those into stories. And about 6 years ago, I became a professor at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University to help inform master's students on exactly how to leverage this as they went on, as they were building their skill sets to take out into the world. So as we think about this, I'm going to take you through just some different elements. It really aligns with my curriculum and how I do it. It's just very compressed. And so what I want to start with really is, as we move through today, if you have any questions, I'm working on 3 screens, so just drop a chat or let me know or just ask a question. You've all been enabled to ask questions by talking, so just let me know. I really try and get people to think about data visualization and storytelling in 3 components, okay? Component 1 is how we think about the questions that we ask. And when I think about the questions that we ask, what we're really trying to do is be focused on, do we come up with good questions? Because the best part of telling a story or getting insights from data is really starting with the questions that we ask. The second part really comes from the marketing side of things. And this is, I spend a lot of time in marketing. My other job besides teaching at Duke is being the chief experience officer at an advertising agency, advertising and marketing agency. And one of the things that a lot of people forget, because we get so into doing the math and the numbers and how we think about the data, that we forget that audiences have different ways of wanting to consume that data. And so we have to think about, and it's very important to think about, who am I telling the story to? It is just like a lot of books, a lot of television shows, a lot of movies, their audience, they're looking to really reach to a specific audience because they know they want to get that audience focused on the story that they're telling. Well, we have to do the same thing with data visualization. And ultimately, we want to engage people in our story presentation. So besides coming up with great questions and then thinking about what we're visualizing, we want to engage them in our presentation. And so as we think about that, and as you think about how you can apply some of these things for what you're working on, I want you to think about this as well. It's one of the things Stephen Few, who's one of the contemporaries in data visualization, he said critical facts that lie hidden in data can only be seen in a picture. So when you think about what that means is a lot of times we get caught up in the numbers and we pull everything together. And when we look at those numbers, it's not blatantly obvious. The other thing that happens is by the function of how we use math, how we get into data, how we get into some of those elements of analytics, we can also run into a challenge. And in running into that challenge, what we can do is we get into something that this proves the point and the importance of data visualization. If you haven't ever heard of Anscombe's quartet, what Anscombe's quartet talks about is if you were to look at these independent data sets and only look at them through the lens of statistical analysis, you'll notice something about these 4 quadrants. These 4 quadrants are identical in mathematical ways. You'll see the trend line that has the exact same slope, but you see the universe of data points is very different when we plot it out. And it tells a very different story. If you look at the upper left versus the lower right in the quadrants, the story that visual tells about what is contained in the data really changes how you understand what the elements of data are. Even though if we were just to simply look at the math, look at the mean, look at the trend line and the trend values, what we would see is they would be identical, even though the data represents a very different story. And so as we think about these elements, one of the things that we know is as we think about that, we don't want to get caught up in the data. And we also need to think about how we visualize and how we tell that story. And too oftentimes people get caught up in other aspects of what's happening and how they are used to using data. I always like this slide because we always think about data and the first thing that people think about is, oh, I got to dump it into Excel. As soon as I dump it into Excel, I'm going to start to, I'm going to be able to start to use it. I'm going to be able to start to do calculations. I'm going to do all these things. But the output of Excel and using Excel as a database, it is great for being able to take a quick look at data. And it can even do some pretty heavy lifting, VLOOKUPs, all the different things that you can do with it. But the thing to remember is that doesn't always tell the story. Very few people can look at tables of data and really understand what's happening. And so a big part of what I've seen over the years and working with some of the biggest companies in the world is that they think about it because they're working with all of this data, that they're surrounded by walls of data. Everybody's pulling data into Excel. Everybody's handing them a report done in Excel, or everybody's handing them just a tabular report or a crosstab of information. And most people can't consume data that way. The majority of people learn visually. We'll talk in a little bit about how the brain really interprets what happens from the neuroscience perspective of how we process information, how we use that. And what's really funny to me is we think about numbers and we think it makes us look really smart when we put a lot of numbers there, or we do a lot of really difficult math. But what really makes a difference is when we can take what we have with all of that data and all of that information, and we can simplify it so anybody can understand it. So our story engages someone, and it causes someone to have a specific reaction that we're wanting to glean from what the data is telling us. Now, that doesn't mean what we want to do is bend the data and bend our story to fit a narrative that isn't supported by the data. But what we want to make sure we do is present it in a way that it's easy for people to interpret, easy for them to understand. And so as we think about this, and as we look at what we do, I like to get everybody in the right mindset, right? And the concept is really simple. When we're thinking about data visualization, we use it every day. If you think about what you see here, this is data visualization. A fuel gauge is really simple. It's the simplest form of data visualization. And why? Because that story needs to resonate very simply, very easily, so people can understand it. Because you don't want to spend a lot of time trying to interpret some numbers on a dashboard when you need to be paying attention to the road, and you also need to know whether you're going to have fuel or not. So when we think about keeping the concept simple, this is an example of data visualization. This is also an example of data visualization. Now, I like to get people out of this mentality that data is just numbers and things that we've pulled down from a database or a CSV file or some data source. We have to think about the story that this tells. Everyone on this call either has one of these, has been sitting next to one of these in a restaurant or on an airplane, and you know exactly what this means, right? It means, and you also know what action needs to be taken, right? As a parent, you know this means one of two things. It's either the same as what we saw on the fuel gauge, that we're empty, or the opposite, that we're full and something needs to be done about it. But it's data visualization. And what data visualization is simply telling a story that we know gives us insight into what's happening that we can then take action on using what we know. Where we've lost this, where it was really simple, as we learned it in grade school. Data visualization was used to help us understand the most basic concepts of math. The ability to do side-by-side comparisons, the ability to quickly process information using those visual cues, using icons, and being able to make it very simple to understand. Do I have more apples or do I have more bananas? We learned this at the basic foundations of going to school. And ultimately, it's those things that if we can simplify it to this level to communicate very complex data problems, then everyone is going to be able to understand, and they're going to be able to engage in the conversation, helping them gain insight and take action from what they need to know. But it all ties back to those questions, right? In this case, do I have more apples or bananas? Simple question to answer. The other problem that we tend to do is we get so excited about our data that we get lost in the excitement of that data. If you look at this, this is a big set of data, right? That's explaining a lot of things. I want you to take a second with this data, and I want you to think about what you're seeing here. You're going to pick up on some keywords like cobblestone and plants and flora, and you're going to see that there's a confidence rating. So I want you to think about what this data is, and I want you to go through in your mind, and I want you to try and draw a conclusion on what you might take action or what it might be. But if I look at the visual, it's a lot simpler. That JSON that I just shared is really just the data version of image recognition that we're seeing here. So when we think about the data that flows from something, doing image recognition and categorizing that is pulling the data into a way that we can sort of understand it by looking at the data itself. But when we look at the picture, it tells a much more robust story. And when we start to think about the robust story and the much more detail that we get by looking at this visualization, rather than what we're seeing in the JSON, because it's hard to interpret in the JSON, we can start to make better conclusions, better decisions, and do them faster, right? It's really clear that this is a fall scene. The leaves are falling off the trees. It makes it easier to understand. So to give you a little bit of background and visualization, and then we'll get into some of the details of really how to do it effectively, I always like to talk about a little history. And so thinking about the history, we had some early data visualization heroes. The early data visualization heroes, one of them is John Snow. And, 3 years ago when I was starting to teach the class, an epidemiologist was not somebody anybody really thought about. In the last 3 years, it's something that's an everyday word. But John Snow was an epidemiologist. They were having a problem. People had died in a neighborhood and they were trying to figure out why. Well, they were looking at it in almost an accounting table of people's names and where they lived and what happened. Well, what John Snow decided to do, instead of having just a ledger page with all of those things, the 1854 version of Excel, he started to plot on a map, just tick marks in all the locations. And all of a sudden, that clustering of data that showed up on a map really identified that the majority of the problems surrounded a water pump on Broad Street that was later determined to be contaminated. But until it was laid out as this kind of bar chart on a map, it did not resonate. They weren't finding the clustering of the information to take advantage of. Another one of our heroes in data visualization was Charles Menard. Now, Charles Menard was just trying to share the story of Napoleon's march and retreat on Moscow. Now, he created this tableau of what exactly happened, and he used a lot of elements that we're going to talk about in how we leverage data visualization to help people really understand how to tell a good story. So what you'll see here, and so you can understand this clearly, is he did a couple of things. This is like the very first dashboard that was ever, that somebody really took advantage of the concept. On the top, you have these line charts, the line in brown moving towards Moscow, and the line in black retreating. And then the dashboard element of this at the bottom, you can see right here, is the temperatures, the ambient temperatures at each of these points in time. And as many of you probably know, part of the challenge of the March on Moscow was not just the battles, but the temperature and the weather and the elements that they were facing. But Charles Menard used a lot of critical elements that led to some items that we use today in data visualization. One, he used different form factors. He used this line chart on top of a map, which gives us perspective. It automatically makes something relatable. He also used width and the size of the line to represent the size of the army, both going and retreating. And you notice how much thinner the line gets when they were retreating. The key to some of this also is he used color. He used the tan as the march out, but he used a very bold black, also, often affiliated with death, on the line coming back to emphasize the significant reduction in Napoleon's army size coming back. So in a simple visualization, you get the entire story of what is happening and how the army started strong and ended up so thin on return. Each of these elements, each of these elements became part of the visualization story. And so as we think about storytelling and our best storytelling elements, when we start to get into this, we start to think about, well, what are good stories? And what are some of the elements of good stories? I got lucky enough to spend some time at the Disney Institute and really thinking about and learning what are some of the key elements to telling stories from some of the world's best storytellers. And one of the things I want you to look at in this image, and I'm sure everybody, and I think you can raise your hand or whatever, is there anybody who hasn't seen this movie? But if you remember in this movie, they are, there's all kinds of things going on. But part of the art of storytelling is making sure that things make sense to the audience. And so a couple of things that really resonate here, and Disney talks a lot about the concept of getting every frame exactly right, from a lighting, from a perspective, from the making sure that nothing feels out of place. And in Toy Story, many of you know, this is the story of toys in a little boy's room. Well, Disney doesn't want the story to break down at any point. So if anything in this picture, whether it is the shadows of the cord, whether it's the shadows on the house out the window, whether it's the shadows of Rex or Buzz not being in alignment with where the light is coming from, then that is going to cause our brains to build a break in the story. And if we have a break in the story, then all of a sudden we're questioning, does this make sense? And we're no longer embedded in the world of these toys who are clearly in a boy's room with the poster board in the back, with, the blocks, the little block sizes, the video game, right? We have to keep our story intact, but we also have to at all times make sure that we're carrying our story forward. And so as we think about these things, there are some elements that as you're starting to put your stories together that you can take advantage of. And one of those things that you can do is learning how to encode data for rapid perception. So I'm going to give you a screen and I'm going to give it to you for 5 seconds. And then I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to have you drop your answers in the chat. So here we go. I want you to tell me how many 5s are on the screen. Time's up. How many 5s are on the screen? Go ahead and drop your answers in the chat. We have an 8. Anybody else going to weigh in?
The chat is disabled on my end. I don't know if anyone else is having that issue.
All right. All right, then just voice them up. We got time. Voice them up. Give me some answers. A couple people weigh in. How many 5s did you see? Catherine, I think you spoke up.
I'm guessing maybe 11.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'm going to say 15.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. So I'm going to put this back up on the screen. Hold on a second. I'm going to put it, yikes, it will not forward for me. Hold on a minute. All right. I'm not going to let you count again because I'm going to make it easier for you. So when we talk about encoding data, when we start encoding it for rapid perception, we can start using things like color. The color sets them out. makes them easier to count. You're going to find out that there are 10 fives in this. But the things that we can do to help people interpret sets of data is use things like color. We can make it better. We can use things like size. We can make those fives jump out, make it easier and quicker to see those things. And then we can use a combination of many things. We can encode data with color. We can put a box around it. We can help it, make it bigger so it stands out. Now, this isn't a great data visualization, but this is to understand some of the form elements that are available to us. So when we talk about design, we're going to talk about how we use form, how we use different elements to help our audience understand and perceive data faster. Well, one of the things that we also have to understand is that our brains process things in certain ways, okay? And so when we think about how our brains process things, there are elements that are pre-attentive, okay? Well, what does pre-attentive mean? Well, what that means is our brain has three different components of memory. It has this iconic memory, like stop signs, we know amazingly really quickly what to do, right? It's our working memory, which is where we're processing, and then we got our long-term memory, right? Well, a lot of things happen in either iconic or at the front end of our working memory. And so there are some things that we can do with pre-attentive attributes that help us tell our stories more effectively. And so one of those things, one of those principles is the Gestalt principles. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Gestalt principles, but these principles of perception really help us interpret visual stimulus that our brain can process really, really quickly, right? And so it helps our brains automatically organize some of this information so we can process it. So on this next slide, I want you to, this is called the principle of proximity. Now, somebody speak up and tell me what direction the dots are going in the left-hand box of dots versus the ones in the right hand. What direction are they going?
The left, they're going horizontally, and the right, vertically.
Are you sure?
No.
Okay. Well, come on, have some confidence there. They are, but they aren't at the same time. Okay. They aren't going in any direction, but our brain processed them as going in a certain direction because of the principle of proximity. If you notice, there is a smaller gap in between the dots, in between them going horizontally, it's smaller versus the gap between them vertically, between these spots. On this one, it's the opposite. The smaller gap is on the vertical spacing and the larger gap is on the horizontal spacing. These are the exact same set of dots. One is turned 90 degrees. And because of the proximity, that principle of proximity, our brains are processing that they are grouped on the left, that they're grouped and making it look like they run horizontal. So they're in horizontal groups versus on the right, they're in vertical groups. And that's what our brain does. Our brain will put things together based on these certain principles. So if it's proximity, as an example, we're seeing those grouped like that. When we're thinking about the principle of similarity, when we use similar items, our brains naturally group them. We have filled in circles and we have empty circles. Our brains are automatically relating the empties and the filled in circles as being related. We don't have to explain it. We don't have to write anything about it. Our brains are already grouping those together and recognizing that, hey, there's something the same about the filled in circles. We don't have to explain it. The same is true when we use enclosure. Enclosure is the whole purpose for highlighting, right? We're enclosing something in a background. That means it's grouped together. We go through books with a highlighter, or we highlight something in a Word doc, or in Excel, we highlight cells. Why? Because we want to emphasize that those things go together. We also do the same thing by putting a box around something, whether enclosing something is in a box or it's just putting a shading that creates a box. Those are elements that our brains automatically pre-attentively process and put together. So when we think about how these things come together, that's where some of this starts to work. There's this, and if this doesn't bother anybody, then okay, we have a problem, because this one really bothers me, because this is about closure and not the like psychological closure where we're looking for emotional closure, but the concept of, if we leave something open, it's going to, number one, draw our attention. Number two, our brains are going to go ahead and finish those pieces. So we can use having something not closed. Our brains want to close it. They want to finish that circle, or they want to finish that rectangle. But by not finishing it, it is a way that we can draw attention to something we really want something to pay attention to in our story. These are all critical design principles. The same is with continuity. We expect a line, no matter how squiggly that line is, to be continuous. When it is not continuous, then our brains are going to try and finish it, but they are also going to stop at all of the spots that are left open. So it's a way, if we have an opening, to recognize exactly where those gaps are. And if we know people are going to follow a line to a gap, it's going to cause us to stop at wherever that gap exists and pay a little bit more attention to what's there. And so the final one is where we get very serious and very, very focused, is if we actually connect the dots, we're helping people connect the dots, right? It's absolutely clear in this visual that each of the horizontal lines are connected to one another, and the vertical dots are not connected. So our brains are going to process this as each row is an independent grouping, because they are not connected with the others. And so when we know these things, when we know how some of these principles work, then it gives us this ability to really take advantage of how we use it, right? So when we start to think about how we make things similar or different, we can use pre-attentive attributes, changing shape. All of those are similar except for the X. We're going to know that that's different. Our brain is processing it because of the principle of similarity. We're using size or enclosure. We can use width and length. All of those things help us process things pre-attentively. The other thing that we can do to help encode data for rapid perception is really focusing on the elements that let us do this. Color is one of the most powerful ways, whether it's the color itself being the hue or the intensity. If you've ever used bold font in any Word document, you're using intensity to emphasize something. Well, that's what color is all about. Certain colors in certain cultures mean certain things, and we can use color to emphasize what we want in our story. We can position things in different areas. That location, how we place something, is going to help our audience, because remember, it's always about our audience perceive what's happening. We can use motion, whether that's actual motion, or it's like we saw with continuity, or we saw with the lines that just by proximity, how our eyes want to follow certain motion. We can also use form elements. And by using form elements, that's, hey, our line length, the width, how we orient things. We can use sizes and shapes. We can add elements to marks that we're presenting. We can enclose things to make them more obvious. Once we do that, those are all key elements that we can use. Well, then what we can start to do is understand in visualization that we have different existing chart types that people are already familiar with. Pie charts are almost always used to look at proportional comparisons. There are some misnomers about pie charts. Everybody's like, pie charts are one of the most popular things out there. They're the way to look at data. What do you think the maximum number of slices you should have in a pie chart would be? Anybody? Anybody got a guess? No guesses?
5.
5 is right. 5 is exactly right. You should have no more than 4 to 6. If you have more than that, then people are not going to be able to process the differences between them. Okay. Between the sizes, you're not going to be getting the purpose of your pie chart. Bar charts are one of the most popular as well. They are really, really good for comparisons. They really are good for highlighting differences. Ultimately, bar charts are probably the most used type of data visualization chart type because they tell really good stories. They can be used for a lot of different things. There are all kinds of bar charts because you have, bar charts like this, you have histograms, you have bullet charts, you have a lot of different ways that you can use bar charts to tell and start to shape your story. Remember, all of these things that I'm talking about, whether it's how we encode for rapid perception and the chart types, are how you put these together to start to form your story. These are just story elements. They're like characters in our story, in a data story. Line charts. Most of the time, line charts are designed to be talked about over time, right? We're so used to them being over time. Line charts are not frequently done vertically. Most of the time, our brains expect to see line charts that move from left to right. And we have to make sure that we understand when our audience is thinking about something, how those move, how our brains are going to interpret them. And we have to have a really good reason if we want to break those rules. It's kind of like breaking the line with continuity. If we have a really good reason and it doesn't break the story, then we can do it. But otherwise, we need to make sure that we're using the right elements to do the right things. Scatter plots are another chart type that get often used and are really good for clustering and finding outliers and doing some really cool things. I always tell a story in my class about the $40 million scatter plot. We had a client who had a ton of data. And they, in one product category, they had 17,000 individual products, and they could not understand why they weren't as profitable as they needed to be. So we plotted in a scatter plot 17,000 items, and it became immediately obvious the outliers that were causing problems with profitability. And so scatter plots, I think oftentimes, because people don't necessarily understand how to use them correctly, but they give you a way to really see concentrations and outliers and clusters of things to really emphasize to someone who may not understand what's happening in the data, but to be able to show those relationships. And then lastly, area charts are the ones I'm going to talk about. And that is, it's really a line chart that is also giving you proportion. So it's like the benefit of a pie chart, but also getting to see that over time and seeing how those proportions change. And then what's also important about this is it follows kind of those same philosophies as a pie chart. You don't want to get too many slices of your area chart or the data can get lost, right? The data can get lost. The other elements of this that are important as you start to think about how all this comes together in storytelling is really thinking about your audience. So when we think about audience visualization, we think a lot about it's not you, it's me. And what I mean by that is too many times when we're trying to tell a story, we're telling something that resonates with us, or that's the way that we would want to understand it. Just like marketers and advertisers and movie makers and authors want to share a story, they're wanting to share a story that resonates with an audience. And so you can't put yourself as an audience of one in the seat of what you're looking at. You have to define the scope. You have to really understand what an audience wants, just like you were segmenting a market for an advertisement. You want to understand what the audience needs to take away or what they're going to want to engage with in your story. And you want to understand the business drivers that make a difference. And then you want to tell their story. You don't want to tell your story. You want to tell their story. You want to communicate that story with the data. And so I'm going to go through a couple of quick examples here. And in those examples, what we have are like in this, the one you're seeing on the screen now, this is someone who wanted to see where they were having manufacturing challenges, excuse me, and where they were having failures based on where it was on the floor, because it was someone who was really engineering, wanting to see where the problems were. In this scenario, this is my former company. And this is a dashboard that I used to look at. It gave every day. It gave me insight into exactly what was going on and a lot of the elements of the business, whether it was what our consultants were doing, whether it's where our clients were, whether we were hitting goals or not hitting goals. But the reason that I show you this is how I wanted to see it, right? So the team that put these dashboards together, I was the audience, and this is how I wanted to see it. The managers, the senior leaders in the organization, this is how they wanted to see it. It's the exact same data, but two different audiences. Me as the CEO who wanted higher level, bigger, less granular, but higher level stuff, versus the managers who wanted to get deep in the weeds of exactly what was going on and get a complete understanding of what was happening. And so while it's the exact same data set, two very different pictures of what was there. Just like that manufacturing floor example that was at the front, this is where someone's wanting to get into the performance analysis at a deeper level and understanding the impact of failure rates, where they're happening, but less concerned about where they are happening relative to the physical space. And so each of these examples talks about how a different audience would want to think about something. So once we think about the elements that we have and the data that we have and why we do what we do, then we get into what are the key elements of our storytelling. And many times you have to think about the characters of your story. So I'm guessing a lot of you know who this little guy is. It's Nemo, right? We know Nemo's story because if we've seen the movie, we understand his background. We understand what makes Nemo Nemo. Just like we know Dory. And Dory's character plays out. And what happens with Dory plays out over time. And we get to understand her. And quite honestly, she gets her own movie. And we also get our paranoid little dad, Marlin. And we understand his story and his character develops throughout, but each of them keep following their character. Well, understanding how that story comes together is really plotting out how three very unique personalities interact to form a story that's taking place. Well, all of this story elements comes from how storytelling really affects our brains. And when we know how it affects our brains, then we can start to build stories that are going to resonate with our audiences. And if we know how those things are going to resonate, then now we can start to know how we're going to build some of these things. So some of the key elements of how our brain gets affected is, one, we want stories that are going to help people tie what's happening in our story to what's going on in their own experience. That's called coupling, right? Think about a story where you were like, wow, that just, I know that character, that person is so much like me, or, oh, I was there and I remember that, right? That's what neural coupling is about. Then we have mirroring. Mirroring is where, if we're a really good storyteller, then they understand and they're tying their coupled experience to it, but now we're generating the reaction that we would have as the storyteller to whatever we're sharing. So if we're wanting to get somebody really excited about some element of information because it's really important, we want our audience to feel that same thing. Just like if I'm telling a sad story and it makes me sad when I get to that part, I want the audience to be tied and be mirroring my emotions, and I want my story to be told in that same way. Then we get the fun chemical part of how stories affect the brain. If we start to have a chemical reaction and we start to release dopamine into our brain, then what happens is now we're really getting emotionally charged, right? We're getting fired up. Dopamine happens when exciting things are happening in our lives and we're having a true chemical reaction to what's happening. But what happens when we release dopamine in our brains is that also those moments in time where we remember those things with much greater accuracy. And so if we can get people to have that chemical reaction, then we're having a successful helping them incorporate what we're sharing. And then finally, if we get all of these things happening and we start processing what's there, now we can actually take action from these insights, right? We can do more with our story. You know, also a lot of times we forget about how to, we start to think about data and we build some visuals and we want to put some visuals together, but we forget to tell a good story. You have to have a story arc. You have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. We want the tension, not necessarily the bad version of tension, but we want tension to exist, to be created, because we want to build to a crescendo. We want to understand what's happening. We want to build that plot, and then we want to get to a resolution. And ultimately, when we do that, we're going to get to a resolution where we have a call to action for our audience, where we either want them to take away and remember what the story is, or to have some action that actually happens. Some of the key elements of that are we have to attract, we have to engage, and we have to have a punchline. In attracting, this is where we really get into our audience. We've got to have a good theme. We've got to determine purpose. We have to set the tone. And most of all, we always have to remember to keep our stories, our data stories simple. Now, the reason we want to keep our data stories simple is because when people start talking about data, they get all nervous and they get scared that they aren't going to understand. And so the more that we can simplify what we're communicating, the more valuable our data story is. We then want to engage them. We choose our visualizations to help engage. This is where we really get into some of those form elements where we want to really think about how we arrange. We're thinking about color and size. We want to make sure we're engaging them by walking them through the story. When we're working with certain tools, we can choose to be interactive or non-interactive. And then ultimately, we want to give them the punchline. The punchline can happen in a couple of ways. We want to, first of all, make sure that we draw clear conclusions, but we also want to decide, do we want to chronologically do it where we build up to the punchline, or do we want to lead with the punchline and then let the rest and then support it with the rest of the story? Ultimately, the punchline is meant to make a lasting impression. Okay, that's the key. So what I want to do here is really quickly go through a couple of examples of the bad and the awful. Okay, and then we'll get to some of the good. But where some of these elements can go wrong very quickly, here is one. Okay, this is the European Parliament Party breakdown. Looks like a pretty safe pie chart. Well, the problem with this pie chart is number one, I told you, and you guys got it right, was that we shouldn't have more than 5 slices, and we got plenty more than 5. What you see right here is that in all these slices, when you get more slices and so many of them become the same size, then we can't tell the difference. We can't delineate. The other problem that we have here is we've got some similar colors. We also have acronyms that no one knows what is. So our story breaks down because we may not know what EPP or ECR or EFD stands for. We've got to always be clear. So what a lot of times we do, and what our wonderful world of technology has done, is said, okay, hey, this is a bad pie chart. Here's a way that we can make it better. Let's make it 3D. 3D never makes anything better. One of the reasons it doesn't make it better, and I love to let students dissect this most of the time, but one of the challenges here, and unfortunately we don't have that much time, one of the challenges here is that when you add 3D, you lose perspective. Besides the problems with the labels and other things, now at this angle, the red and the big red and the big blue slice look eerily similar in size, even though they're significantly different. The 3D, once you add the 3-dimensional perspective, creates challenges. This is another example of where 3D goes completely wrong. Number one, we got all kinds of labeling problems. 2, now we have data points hidden behind other data points, and so we can see some of them. We've tilted our chart, and by tilting our chart, we've completely changed the perspective to not be able to line up the lines to know what matches up, completely messing up our story. So as we think about these things, and as you think about different ways, because 3D might look cool, it doesn't, and most of the time doesn't help us tell a better story. Lastly, we have to be super careful with infographics, because I want you to look at this infographic. This is the changing face of America based on ethnicity and race, and it's a projection. And what I find amazing about this is this tells a really false story, right? Just by the way it is laid out. And when you think like some of those other examples, well, those probably just landed in a report. This was on the nightly news, right? This was on the nightly news. And what you have here is when you start to take a chart type, like an area chart, and now you try and make it cute into an infographic because you want to lay it over the US, all of a sudden, now your story really changes. Our story arc changed. Number one, it makes it look like the different races and ethnicities are geographically tied. Number two, it makes it look like in the middle year, because there just wasn't enough real estate to show it in 2010, that a couple of our groupings didn't exist in 2010. So all of our Asian Americans only existed in 1960 and in 2060, but none of them were here in 2010. And you now start to tell a story that isn't the story you're looking to tell. So I want to also share a couple examples of the good. So give me just a second, because I've got to grab a different screen and drag it out here. But there are some elements that we can look at. And I pulled some of these from Tableau Public, but that are good examples of storytelling. One of the things that's a really good example of storytelling here is Boeing giving consistent, it's going to refresh, giving consistent color. It's got consistent design. It's using some of the good things like connected. They're using a few too many slices on their pie chart. They are using KPIs at the top with icons. One of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about because we only have an hour is the use of icons, and how icons are one of those pre-attentive things that our iconic memory gets to take advantage of, so we can relate to them really quickly, and how they come together. Another thing that is done really well on some in some examples is you see this recreational visits to national parks. This immediately sets a theme. We know we're talking about national parks, the trees, the tree icons, the hiking, the feet, the line chart, all done really well to give you and get you into your story theme really quickly. And then the individual breakdowns give you some more detail and keep it very simple so you can see the trends and the involvement at all of the different national parks over the years. Sometimes we're telling different stories. We're telling stories of what maternity leave is really like. We get pictures of the baby at week 1 through week 12. We get to understand how many times we're changing diapers, how many times we're feeding, when those are getting changed, and we can get interactivity with clicking or doing other things. So we're engaging people in our story. What's cool about this is pictures of babies always grab someone's attention. So when we think about the elements of the story and attracting attention, using things like icons at Boeing or the trees and the footprints, icons or pictures of a baby, those things all do the part of attracting attention. Another one is laying it into, and I love this one because what you're seeing here as this refreshes is this is some very hard statistics on food deserts in the US and being able to understand what percent of the population is living in a food desert, where there are higher concentrations by state. But what is really good about this visual is its use of colors. They used a long format here because it's meant to be like an article, like a white paper that's giving people information and really informing them. These charts, the use of color in this example is fantastic because they're trying to get us, they're using grays and tans and oranges to make something bold, but it automatically gets you in the mindset of I'm in this desert. I'm in this area that isn't, you know, what I expect. And so as you start to think about those stories, you've got to find what your storyline is, how you want to tell that story, using big, bold numbers, using arrows and things to walk people through by connecting them. So with that being said, I just gave you like the super duper fast version of data visualization and storytelling. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts or anything else that they want to know?
What do you use for like making the graphs?
So I use what I use to teach with in class is Tableau. We have you know, some people use Power BI. Some people do it using using other like coding based tools. All of those, any of those are available. You can use Excel to create some of these chart types as well, right? The key is how you start to put these visuals together to tell stronger stories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. What else? All right. Well, I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you gained something from it and it helps you all with what you're working on and to tell those stories. And you know, I hope it was worth the hour of your time on a Wednesday night.
It definitely was. No, this was great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And we will see all of you in DC very shortly. We'll send out a recording of the webinar as well. Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.